I'm confused. Are you confused? Do you have a little bit more clearer information? What's going on? Let's start with the NYSE. What's going on there?
Yeah, and David, so much for easing back into the new year. We're all confused. I think I talked to colleagues who've worked in this space for 20 years like I have, and this is a very strange situation to have a potential reversal of an existing reversal regarding the delisting effort. I think one thing needs to be made clear. The executive order that came out in November, there was a 6-week gap between when that EO was dropped and when the Treasury Department actually put out guidance. And in that 6-week period, companies had to begin making decisions for how to manage and mitigate risk accordingly. And so I think for some, they really did the best they could given the information that was available. But this was a bit of a troubling situation in how Treasury implemented the rollout of this executive order from November.
Okay, that being said, what are you tracking next? I mean, in terms of clarity then, is there anything based on public information that we have, and I'm holding the EO here, I'm also holding the statement out of the Commerce Ministry. Is there anything here that informs you of what might happen next?
So, obviously we've got 2 weeks left of a Trump administration, and there's nothing to say that a Biden administration couldn't potentially put the brakes on the implementation of this law that comes into force on January 11th, where no U.S. persons can continue to purchase securities for these 35 listed companies. Now, I think there's certainly an advantage to creating confusion that forces the divesting that we've certainly seen. We've seen securities be removed from index funds, and that wasn't the stated objective of the sanctions themselves. The sanctions would restrict purchase, but didn't on their face force delisting of companies off of exchanges and force divestments, at least up until January 11th. So you certainly see an administration that benefited from the confusion to achieve their objective of trying to keep U.S. capital away from Chinese companies.
Do we have any sense, Dan, you touched on this, as to what the priorities of the Biden administration, the incoming Biden administration, will be when it comes to the capital market links between China and the U.S. and particularly to Chinese corporates? I
think, Tom, it's pretty clear that you'll have a less combative approach for dealing with China. I think some of these packages, similar to what you announced with the 8 payments companies that were designated under another executive order for banning tonight, will be done with a bit more market consideration, which has happened in the past. I think the U.S.-Russia sanctions were a good example where the market was really working with the government in advance of the sanctions to deal with unanticipated consequences. But bluntly, the Biden administration is going to have to deal with the cards they're dealt. They can't start anew, so they're going to have to leverage the foundational elements that the Trump administration put in place, particularly with China.
Just in terms of the specific EO that we've seen just in the last few hours, this executive order banning the transactions with these 8 Chinese apps, we've seen Alibaba and Tencent up today in terms of the market reaction. And that's despite the fact that both of their payment apps are included in this executive order. How do you think Chinese corporations should be thinking about this executive order? Is it more symbolism at this point? Does it come down to the fact that we don't know how the Commerce Department is going to put this into practice?
Well, and the other thing to bear in mind is it likely won't be Donald Trump's Commerce Department putting this into practice anyway. By the time this ends up getting to the point of implementation, it will be a Biden administration. I think the other thing to bear in mind, and likely why the market is reacting how it is, this isn't the first time we've seen an executive order where social media and Chinese payments companies were caught in the mix and banned under national security auspices, all the while being struck down by federal judges in the United States. So there isn't a great track record of the Trump administration trying to ban these Chinese apps and companies under the auspices of a national security threat. There have been very few instances where that succeeded outside of the CFIUS hurdle, which has struck down certain deals on national security grounds, but with clear evidence behind it.
You know what's been lacking, Dan, and I'm guessing this might be part of the story where we go from here. We keep talking about, Donald Trump doing this, trying to do this, banning this and banning that. We haven't talked about what happens the other way around. In what form do you think China may respond?
So I think China has been extremely measured in its response to the entire U.S. China sanctions and then tariff debate over the last year plus. I think you saw between the sanctions related to the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, between the sanctions related to Uyghur labor in Xinjiang province. I think Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, two U.S. senators, were designated twice in response to those actions that were taken over the summer. Similarly, you saw China roll out the equivalent of OFAC on the Chinese side, the unreliable entity list. However, no one has been designated under it. So I think China is really waiting out the Trump administration until a Biden administration is in place, for hoping that cooler heads will prevail, although recognizing that some of these issues can't really be bottled back up so easily.
Dan, do you have a view on what other areas of the capital markets could be targeted? I mean, under the Biden administration, let's assume that they continue to take a tough line, even if the rhetoric calms down to some extent. Are there other areas that may be pursued?
I think you may see a kind of a restoration of some of the more predictable elements. For years, there's been cases related to banks across Asia, across China, clearing U.S. dollar-related transactions in violation of certain U.S. sanctions prohibitions. And that's something that investigations over the years has certainly brought about some clarity on. The securities space in this type of geopolitical issue is tough. The only other comparison that we really have is U.S. and Russia on the sectoral sanctions from 2014, where debt and equity transactions were heavily restricted, but a lot of business was able to be carried out. I think you're going to see a more surgical approach going forward, where you may have certain larger Chinese companies that are found to have links to human rights violations or other sorts of perceived malign abuses in the eyes of the U.S. But I think you'll see a more scalpel-like approach for how they're implemented in a Biden administration versus a bit of a scattershot approach that we've seen over the last few years with Trump.